that will follow draws on primary data produced in part under the Mediterranean Environment Networks and Actions Program, which was carried out through funding by the European Commission and the University of Crete sources. It will show how a national campaign evolved since the beginning of the crisis. A national campaign unprecedented in size and scale, which began in Greece in early 2010, when the first measures were imposed by the Troika of the European Commission, European Central Bank and IMF. For the first time, the IMF appearing in the Eurozone region. During the course of these 3 years, this campaign has not only built on previous experiences with former mobilizations, but also made connections to the rhythms of economic and political contention in the Arab Indignado and Occupy protest. The aim is to offer evidence on the spatial features of the Greek campaign in the context of transnational economic opportunities and threats. The focus will be at 3 levels. It will show the parliamentarization of contention, the square or piazza camps and street contention in urban spaces across the country, and also the links to transnational cyber protests related to the Greek contention. It will trace 31 large protest events, which begin with 5,000, but also have as high as 500,000 participants, with similar claims forming a durable national campaign. For each of the large events, eventually we had protests across the whole country, synchronized, parallel and sustained, and thus we have a new type of mobilization with, promoted by the crisis. The ultimate aim of the paper will be to contribute to discussions on the spatial aspects of economic contention campaigns from the local to the national and transnational levels. Spatial dimensions do not only comprise the physical context in which protest occurs, but also that of a wider global landscape where new transnational economic and political opportunities and threats affect repertoires of contention and claims, not only within the European Union, but beyond. The research approach applied is a variant of protest event analysis. We attempt to integrate protest event and political discourse approaches as Tilly and Koopmans, especially Koopmans, has done through political claims analysis, but this part of the data processing is not completed. The national campaign, as well as the high frequency of large contentious events in Greece, occurs in the current thickened period, according to Basinger, which is a period when the pace of challenging events quickens to the point that it becomes practically impossible to comprehend them, and they come to constitute an increasingly significant part of their own causal structure. Basinger studied former Soviet Union protests in the 80s and 90s. Thus, the unit of analysis was chosen to be the large protest events. We have so many protests going on and contentious events every day almost in the entire country that in order to study it we would need quite good research budgets. So we chose this unit of analysis because it facilitates the systematic tracing of all key events and synchronized actions at the national level, which have been sparked by neoliberal adjustment and austerity policies in this southern European country. These large events mostly involve demonstration marches, rallies, national strikes, and piazza protests, with claims against austerity and or neoliberal policies for the first 3 years of the Greek crisis, which basically are in January 2010 to December 2012. There have been events in January that are not covered in this data set. We have, yesterday we had a big national strike which froze the country. We've had farmers blockades across the entire country for the past 2 weeks. And we also had a very big anti-racist national scale event with the participation of 26 cities beyond Greece. So, as we study this, the data set keeps on getting bigger, so there was a cut line for this presentation, and that is December 2012. Now, as I mentioned, as the data we're picking up from 16 to now 32, we certainly realized that we were talking about a campaign, and we're doing also network analysis of the claims, and shows how similar claims are being made all over the country. Now, a campaign, according to Tilly and Taro, comprises a high level of contention involving whole populations engaged in wider struggles defined as sustained, organized public efforts, making collective claims on target authorities, constituting one element of a social movement. Tilly defined it as a unit of analysis extending beyond any single event. Although social movements often include petitions, declarations, and mass meetings, the campaign always links 3 different parties, a group of self-designed claimants, some object of claims, and a public of some kind. The claims may target governmental officials, but the authorities in question can also include owners of property, religious functionaries, and others whose actions significantly affect the welfare of many people. The campaign has taken place at 3 levels. The first level is the parliamentarization of contention. Now, Tilly's work has inspired some parts of this paper. I went back to one of his papers in 1997. It was important for me because the parliament has been the central focus of the national campaign, as well as the international, the transnational that evolved. So I wanted to refresh my memory on the parliament as the object of ordinary people's contention, and parliamentary action incited ordinary people's claim-making, whether directed to parliament or elsewhere. Issues currently being considered by parliament became more central to popular contention, and contentions with parliament became more central in a wide range of claim-making. In the case of Greece, the persistence of parliament-directed protests attests to the high significance and durability of national-level institutions acting as the main targeted challenge group, still considered responsible for securing the social welfare of the country's population, even when powerful global economic and political actors exercise overwhelming pressure on the state. Situated in the center of Athens, the Greek parliament, former palace buildings, oversees Syntagma Constitutional Square, which may be seen as an extension of its courtyard. Syntagma has always been the platia, piazza, where mass demonstrations and rallies voiced their claims and attempted to influence the Greek political scene. Today, Syntagma goes back to 1843, where the Greek public revolted and succeeded in forcing King Otto to grant them a new constitution. Since then, it has been a space of contention and negotiation between the public and the modern Greek state, and a space of street politics where protests claim their rights. Some of the most significant contestations which occurred there have been the bloody December of 1944, which witnessed the killings of many communists and ignited the Greek Civil War, the massive protests against the catastrophic forest fires which cost the lives of more than 80 people in 2007, the December 2008 protests against the police violence and neoliberalism's effects on youth, and the large and intense anti-austerity protests of the recent period. It also hosted the April 2012 suicide of a retired pharmacist who shot himself dead during the morning rush hour in the middle of Syntagma, shouting that he was not doing it, in order not to pass his debts to his families. The picture that you see is from the 10th day of the People's Assembly in the June 2011 Greek Aganaktismeni or Greek Indignados movement. Claims of participating groups in large protest events for this 3-year period opposing Troika and state policies show the highest frequencies in the following, and these frequencies are all greater than 78%. The groups demand that the overwhelming claims that will impact their lives are dramatic wage and pension decreases, tax increases, privatization of public enterprises and education, in addition to neoliberal structural reforms. These claims stress serious concerns about the impacts on economy, society, but also sovereignty and democracy. The resolutions most often proposed are to tax the rich, create jobs, provide social welfare. Next in frequency are proposals for the resignation of responsible politicians, for the ceasing of privatizations and the annulment of the externally imposed austerity policies. In the Constitution or Syntagma Square, protesters addressed Parliament for the 3-year period. You see in the red Syntagma Square in front of the Parliament. This photo was constructed by bloggers aiming to offer better estimates of the number of participants in the large events of the second period. This was 19th of October 2011. But this was repeated throughout the 3-year period. It was very typical. During the summer of 2011, it is estimated that more than 2.5 million visited Syntagma's Piazza movement, where more pragmatists but angrier upper piazza and more progressive and alternative lower piazza placed themselves in the same square. While the upper part attracted demonstrators with more patriotic and populist claims, the lower part hosted the camp and a direct democratic-oriented agora of highly committed activists, many of whom derive from radical parties of the left. The data set of the 31 large protest events depicts a national campaign against neoliberal reforms and austerity policies. It has an urban character, very high numbers of participants, imagining a different world. The data also reflects the influence of a Mediterranean urban movement of the piazzas, as Leontido put it, across and beyond the Mediterranean in the activist discourse. The question about how protest spreads across space over time has not been studied using geographic information systems. There are a few works that are rare. Thornton is one of them on the Chinese protests. This was the first time we tried to do a mapping of the large protest events because I thought it was quite interesting to see the national campaign on the map. So I have this one with all the total number of events per city or town across Greece for the 3 years period. And in the second map, we have the participation in the 3 different phases of the 3-year period. The second phase being a pre-election period. Before that is the May and June 2012 elections. Now, This happened a few years ago. A 16-year-old teenager was shot by a policeman using social media technology. Protests spread across the entire country. In the anti-austerity campaign, this was very intense. This is the first time that we had the occupation of piazzas across the entire country. And if you can see it, it is the period of red, the second period, the pre-election period, is the period also of the Greek Indignados, again like this many, that saw tremendous numbers of very broad cross-sector and cross-class coalitions mobilizing. You can see it also that the second phase, the middle three peaks of the second phase are sharpest in the action forms that are the major action forms in this graph of the 32 large protest events. Blaming political parties for the country's critical condition, also showing their disrespect in front of the parliament to their politicians. They rejected political party affiliations and adopted peaceful events and actions. So we had the participation of hundreds of thousands of people, especially in the second phase. And of course we had direct democratic, I don't know if you can see it, but the light blue is the direct democratic action forms, which also appear in the later phases of the campaign and not in the beginning. In the beginning we have more conventional protests, more labor union, conventional participating groups. This can be also seen in the graph of participating groups. We basically have unions, worker confederations, political parties, especially of the left, but not only, anarchist and anti-authoritarian groups, youth groups, students, pupils, justice-oriented groups, and networks. We have very important new ones in that area as well. Again, like these many, civil society groups and also professional and educational organizations. The third level of the spatial feature of the national campaign is the transnational element. We have the participation in a new phase of transnational contention, that is the one that happens with the financial crisis across US, European and Mediterranean regions. The campaign has been linked to transnational spaces of contention, and this is, I think, the first time that a national anti-austerity campaign has done so. Latin American ones, the 80s, were basically national campaigns. You can see here the participation in transnational spaces of contention. They're the red ones. The Occupy day of 15th of October 2011 was not placed on it because it had a participation of 950 cities, so I couldn't do it in this graph. But in the next tables you will see clearer the 5 large protest events that link to the European Revolution, 29 May, with the participation of all cities in Europe. We had 32 Greek cities involved and 26 non-Greek cities involved. We also had 2 cities involved in the Occupy Wall Street European Indignados Day. We had the Transnational Solidarity Action Day for Greece, we're all Greeks, the 18th of October. And the participation in the first European Union strike day versus austerity this fall in November. And we also had in this January 2013, the anti-fascist and anti-austerity demonstration, which incidentally was organized at least 1 month before the January 19th, but it coincided with a killing, the fatal stabbing of a Pakistani immigrant in Athens. The protest spread across 26 non-Greek cities and 25 Greek, 25 Greek and 26 non-Greek. When we look at the participation in the transnational protest, participation of non-Greek cities, these are placed in Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, Denmark, UK and US. And they appear mostly in the second phase of the campaign, but also in the third. Street square politics are intricately tied to the new transnational economic landscape of key power holders promoting neoliberalism. New transnational economic and political opportunities and threats have been seen to affect the repertoire of claims and contentious actions in Greece. And the findings on the spatial feature point out to a revitalization of politics with high numbers of very broad cross-sector coalitions across the country, not only at the national but at the transnational level. We also have the coexistence of older and newer forms of action repertoires, and although it was not part of the spatial aspects of this paper, I think that the next thing that we have to also expect in the study of this is the interplay between the economic contention, economic voting in a context that is very, very rapidly moving. Thank you.
Raised by the Indignados in Madrid, in Spain. And indeed the movement had at the beginning national and global objectives, and it quickly tried to become international, but it has been transformed over time by decentralizing its activities in the neighborhoods and by refocusing its form of action on concrete and local stakes. To maintain their mobilization over time, the Indignados had to develop decentralized forms of organization and concrete actions, like the fight against housing eviction. Their refusal to pass by the electoral way to obtain a political change so imposed them to find places of action, to give substance to their mobilization, and to take away first victories. This process of localization of collective action has been the object of recent analysis in the sociology of social movements. For Merkel and players, numerous social movements and local actors have placed their hopes in the transformation at local level, seeing an adequate frame to improve their living conditions and the quality of social relationships. Merkel showed, for example, how the neighborhood became, since the 80s in Argentina, a place for the organization of solidarities and cooperation in front of the weakening of labor union memberships. Do we observe a similar evolution for the Indignados, and why? How to place concretely this shift of collective action from global and national claiming to more concrete and local modes of action, and which debates this localization of action generated among the participants. My analysis leans on a field research led in Madrid, mainly from May 2011 to February 2012, based on informal interviews and on participating observations. I observed the camp, the assemblies in Puerta del Sol and in several neighborhoods, and demonstration. My plan will be chronological to show the evolutions of the movement, and I distinguish two stages that appeared in the slogan, "Take the square," and then "Toma la plaza," and then "Take the neighborhoods, toma los barrios." The first stage was characterized by camps on central squares, assemblies with thousands of participants in city centers, and national demonstrations. And from the beginning, the Indignados had a strong will of internationalization of their action. The second stage was characterized by the decentralization of the movement in neighborhoods and by the shift of actions on local and concrete stakes. It allowed the Indignados to register their first victories, but it also shows the limits of a localized action. So the first stage of the movement that gets media attention was relatively short. It extended essentially from May till June 2011, when counts multiplied on central squares of several Spanish cities by following the example of Puerta del Sol. In spite of their relatively brief duration, these camps had a considerable influence on the movement, its forms of organization and internal democracy. It was during this period when the participation was the most massive and the most heterogeneous. The demonstration of May 15, 2011 was not organized by traditional organizations as political parties or labor union, but by collectives established in internet who transmitted the call by social networks. The call underlined the global dimension of the mobilization by mentioning, as in so many other countries around us, there is an increasing social dissatisfaction. The claiming was situated above all in a national frame by denouncing the perversity of the economic and political system at the origin of the crisis. It indicated that the political and economic powers are responsible for the painful situation in which the citizens are. So the initial claiming joined two scales, national and international, and put forward the responsibilities so much of the political system as of the economic model in the social crisis. Thus, at first, the target of the Indignados in the slogan, "They don't represent us," were not only political organizations, many political parties and labor unions, but also the economic ones, in particular the banks. We can understand this denunciation in the context of economic crisis, connected to the housing speculation based on complicity between the political and the economic elites. This crisis had particularly violent social consequences in Spain. For instance, at the beginning of 2011, the unemployment rate reached more than 21%, and much more for young people. And the evictions from housings multiplied. As underlined it, Goodwin and Hetland, it's necessary to consider the influence of economic factors in the emergence of the mobilization. The call of May 15 said about capitalism, the current obsolete and internatural economic model blocks the social machine in a spiral which auto-destroys itself by enriching few ones and by diving all the other into the poverty. And this criticism of capitalism was systematically linked to the politicians' behavior. This questioning of the representative political system came along with the claiming and with the implementation of another democracy, a real democracy based on the principles of self-management, deliberation, and open participation to all. I'm not going to develop here this question of internal democracy as other speakers will do it, but I'd like to say a word on the conflict in these assemblies about the relationship with politics. The work groups on politics in Puerta del Sol divided itself from the beginning into subgroups. A group of short-term politics tried to influence national public policies, and it agreed on 4 proposals to improve the current system: reform of the electoral law, fight against corruption, effective separation of powers, and creation of citizens' control mechanisms. Meanwhile, the group of long-term politics defended another strategy. For them, the change doesn't pass by the electoral way, but by the promotion of local experiments, as the occupation of buildings to provide accommodation for the persons expelled from their housing, or the creation of cooperatives to develop an alternative economic model to the capitalist system. And the tension between both groups increased with the election of November 12, 2011. For the first one, it will be necessary to be able to establish proposals and to question the candidates on this basis. For the second, it was necessary to follow its own programs of fight. And finally, the Indignados refused to commit themselves in the electoral campaign. During this first stage, the global dimension of the movement was obvious. It expressed itself of 2 manners. On the one hand, the Indignados claimed foreign models of mobilization, mainly the Arab revolutions, more punctually Iceland, Portugal, or Greece. On the other hand, the Indignados attached importance to the international dissemination of their movement. They created a committee of international extension in the first days to spread the camp in other countries by internet, the social networks, and direct contacts. I'm not going to develop this dimension because Eduardo will do it in his communication this afternoon, but I would like now to pass to go into the second part. Another strategy was led in parallel to this internationalization of the movement, is decentralization in the neighborhoods. The end of the camp in Puerta del Sol on June 12, 2011 was presented as a new strategy, as in the slogan, "We don't go away, we extend us." The aim was to root the mobilization locally, to avoid that it lost its dynamism, and to assure the pursuit of the movement by removing it from the temporary future of the camp. The first neighborhood assemblies were all organized on May 28, 2011. At the beginning, participation was massive. According to the website Toma los Barrios, they were organized in 140 neighborhoods and suburbs in Madrid, gathering more than 28,000 participants. The first assemblies aimed at discussing the internal organization of the assembly and at declining the global claiming of the Indignados in actions on local scale. For example, in the first assembly in Carabanchel, a popular neighborhood in the south of Madrid, several themes emerged as housing, employment, immigration, education, or health. And concrete proposals were formulated with regard to the situation of the neighborhoods, as stopping any housing eviction, getting back available lands to create housing and social equipment, or fighting against the closure of a public school. Participants also discussed the process of decentralization. Some of them underline the limits of this territorialized approach. The problems we have in the neighborhoods are the problem of all the neighborhoods. The problem is the world in which we live. I believe that in this assembly should take out the problem of Spain, not of these neighborhoods. And this participant in Caravanchel formulated the risk of a local confinement of the movement and the relevance of a territorial organization to face problems that have global origins. However, the decentralization of the movement didn't mean a giving up of the more global strategy. The will of internationalization of the movement remained intact, as confirmed the call for global demonstration on October 15, 2011. Besides, assemblies continued in Puerta del Sol, but conflict of legitimacy emerged between the dynamics of neighborhoods and the more general one. The identification to the neighborhood began to enter in competition with that of Puerta del Sol. This tension showed itself by a growing conflict between Puerta del Sol General Assembly and the Popular Assembly of Madrid, which coordinated the neighborhood assemblies. The risk of demobilization stemming from these conflicts was partially avoided by the first victories that registered the movement made possible by its decentralization. The stop of an immigrants' control in a subway station in Caravanchel on June 4, 2011, circulating in the popular neighborhoods of Madrid, which suggested repeating the action. And the effect of demonstration was also powerful, with the stop of housing eviction on June 15, 2011, when Indignados of all Madrid answered to the call of the Assembly of Tetuan. Since then, the calls had multiplied to prevent housing eviction in every corner of the capital. Connection had been so quickly established between the various neighborhood assemblies and existing social organizations as a platform of the mortgage victims to lead direct action against the main social consequences of the economic crisis. If they didn't transform the political and economic system, these concrete actions were a guarantee of continuity, as exploited on Indignado in Caravanchel on June 11, 2011. We have to register a victory, even if it's small, to continue to fight. In all the neighborhoods, we could observe also concrete practices of social solidarity with the creation of better networks of mutual support, or banks of time. The aim was not only to propose solutions to persons particularly affected by the economic crisis, but also to show that other exchanges are possible outside of the market economy. As in the Argentine case, analyzed by Merkel after the crisis in 2001, the neighborhood became a privileged place for the organization of solidarities and cooperation. The movement also turned to more radical actions, as occupying disused buildings, to rehouse expelled families, and to organize the activities of the movement in winter. In view of these evolutions, some Indignados noticed during informal discussion that the group of long-term politics won with regard to the group of short-term politics. The refusal of the electoral way brought the Indignados to develop fights on concrete problems, to show the efficiency of their action on a local scale, for lack of being able to have an influence on the policies on international and national scales. As for the indigenous movement analyzed by players in Mexico, we may distinguish two factors explaining the strategy of localization of collective action. First, the absence of consideration of the claiming by the government, and secondly, the redeployment of a political culture which conceives social change from the local scale. But these dynamics on the neighborhoods scale has gradually decreased, as showing the diminution of participation in neighborhood assemblies. Paradoxically, against the identity of the movement, the assemblies of the Indignados had been transformed into assemblies of activists. This problem was taken into account by the Committee of International Extension in Puerto del Sol, which decided in mid-December 2011 to put itself on strike of activism to alert on the militant drift of the movement. 1 year after May 15, 2011, you may wonder about a return of the global stake, even if it had never really disappeared from perspective and action of the movement. For instance, since the announcement of the rescue plans of banks in spring 2012, the Indignados had multiplied the action against banks and bankers as a complaint against all the board of directors of Bankia during 2011 for falsification of accounts and swindle. To conclude, you may wonder if the strategy of localization of collective action wasn't finally an addition of helplessness from a social movement which refused to transform itself into a political movement and to commit itself in the electoral fight. It should indicate the difficulties of current social movement in front of the economic crisis and of the austerity policies to encircle the enemy against whom to lead the fight. Stéphane Hessel put forward these difficulties in his essay and in Yevu. You comments with his size, we don't have to deal anymore with a small elite, the action of which we understand clearly. It's a vast world of which we feel good that it's interdependent. We can find in this imperceptible character of the enemy one of the explanation of the association of the Indignados between the globalization and the localization of their action. And finally, this evolution was probably similar to other movements, for instance, in the Occupy movement in the United States. So I would like to subject this question to the debate. Thanks a lot.
So I'm not trying to explain who invented it, I'm trying to explain why groups adopt it as an organizational form. So, first, what am I talking about here? The reason I'm focusing on horizontalism, and some people will argue about the word, whether it's, we should talk about direct democracy or participatory democracy or anarchism, sort of, I think that's the detail. But I think it's the lowest common denominator of all those protests we've seen in Spain, in Greece. I mean, North Africa is a different story, but I think Greece, Spain, to some extent Italy, and definitely Occupy in the US, and also the Occupy movement in Canada as well. So there's always this, putting aside the local politics, the claims, the specifics of each occupation, there's always this organizational form that all those protests share, which is basically leaderless. I'm going to go quickly over this because it's basically just a grocery list. So, horizontal, I mean, it seems straightforward, but no leaders, no hierarchy. This idea that really it's by participation that each individual should be empowered and have his or her voice taken into account in the process, throughout the process, not just like once when you vote, but really throughout the process, hence the emphasis on deliberation as a way of making decision, and then sometimes consensus, but that also varies across places. This emphasis also on real democracy as opposed to representative democracy or elitist democracy. In Spain, for example, one of the groups that called for the occupation on May 15, 2011 was called Democracia Real, and now has its French version also, Démocratie Réelle, and Real Democracy now, so we have different ways of saying the same thing basically. And the idea of prefiguration, meaning basically that the occupation should embody the ideal society. So basically, the means are the ends, and the ends are the means. So we should not wait for this, moment in the future, like the Marxist-Leninist version of the story, where the state will disappear and have this class society and so on. We should live today as we would like to live. So basically, we should practice the ideal instead of just waiting for it. This thing was basically, to simplify the story, was embodied in the assembly, the General Assembly, as a space of deliberation, as a space where people feel empowered, where people basically, sometimes for the first time, dare to speak in public and make decisions together, and as I said, through consensus. That's not me, right? No. And finally, I'd like to build on Elizabeth Clement's work here. So, organizational form as frame, meaning that, at least from what I've seen in Montreal, and I would say that applies sometimes to other occupations as well, there was not a clear discourse about horizontalism. There was not a clear frame. Saying everything that I said is just the way things got organized that basically represented the frame. So the organizational form is the frame here. It's not necessarily a clear discourse, a clear ideology. It is the way you organize that is the message. So why is this happening? And I'm going to go faster on this, but basically, different ways of explaining this. One way that is pretty popular is that, well, there's a crisis of representative democracy. People no longer vote, no longer believe in parties, so it's normal that we will organize horizontally. There's this claim, if you think about, Suzanne Berger, my advisor, published a piece in the 70s about the anti-politics in Western Europe, where this crisis of representative democracy led people to organize outside of the political system. Hence, all the focus about civil society and so on. I would say that this is very questionable, that a crisis of representative democracy will lead to horizontalism, for a very simple reason, putting aside the specifics of the causal mechanisms involved, that we can very well imagine that a crisis of representative democracy will lead to just apathy, people not participating, period, or to fascism, the rise of the far right, or it could lead to a rise of, Trotskyist parties, as they were organized, in France. And Trotskyist parties are not horizontal; they're just, democratic centralism, so the Marxist-Leninist tradition. So basically, why this form as opposed to another here? Basically try to problematize horizontalism, not take it for granted, not assume that it's obvious that people should organize this way, and try to explain, how come, why not through a more very vertical way, through different ways of acting together. One common answer is to focus on repertoires, building on Tilly, or if we use Hans Wheeler toolkits, cultural toolkits, or Scalpel talked about cultural idioms. Basically, routinized ways of organizing, routinized ways of acting together that are available at a specific point in time, in a specific place. Now that seems to apply. Most of the people that I interviewed, that I talked to, had been involved in some form of horizontal organizing before. Some had participated or were still active in the global justice movement, had attended the Quebec protest in 2001, or had been active in a social forum. So different forms that fit more or less horizontalism. So you can say, well, it comes from that experience, and they're just reproducing what they know. And that fits different studies about how social movements evolve and tactics and so on. The problem with that is that many participants were just suffered from amnesia. They just forgot what they've done, what existed in the past. They had basically no clear knowledge of past protest, mobilization, past events. Or sometimes we're just completely ignorant. Many people that I talked to were convinced they were inventing the hands, were convinced they were the first time they were, had the blocking, the procedures, as if they were just inventing all that stuff, and nobody had ever used it before. So if people are not even aware that they're building on tradition, it's hard to claim that it's repertoire that's shaping all this. Another claim could be, it's just a strategic choice to manage heterogeneity, or the diversity of the movement. The problem here is that, and that's what I'm trying to show, most participants did not know what they were doing at the beginning of the process. So it was not a kind of strategic calculation of saying we should do this because then we'll manage heterogeneity or pluralism in the occupation. I think it was really deciding how to organize as they were doing it. They did not have a clear plan, a clear model to follow. They were basically building the model as they were, deliberating. And I would say even when one thing is just diffusion, they were just copying Occupy Wall Street, they were just copying the Indignados, but even that happened, putting aside the date of when it began, October 15, even that took place after the beginning of the occupation. It was not, it didn't take place at the very beginning. So, what I'm going to claim here is that first, most people saw the occupation as an opportunity to experiment different ways of acting together, different ways of organizing. Second, that all this was defined and redefined and reconstructed in the process. There was not a clear model, it was just implemented. It was being constructed and defined as people were mobilizing and organizing. And there was a process of trial and error. People tried different mechanisms, whether consensus, then voting, then lowering the threshold for decisions and so on. So different ways of basically organizing and managing the assembly, different ways of managing committees and making decisions, and that was really a process of trial and error. And the claim here is that horizontalism was not a common goal from the very beginning. It was not a clear frame, it's not a clear ideology. It's not just a automatic reaction to the crisis of representative democracy. It's more like a hybrid and uncertain outcome of a political and practical process. So political because we had different, maybe the word is not factions, but let's say different branches or currents in the occupation, arguing, fighting about their status, how to define the rules of the game, what's the best way to organize, and so on. And practical because many people were just involved in solving problems, logistics, food, kitchen, toilets, dealing with the police, dealing with the media. So just practical issues, and that also led to how they organized. So, because I don't have much time, I think 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. So I'll skip the method. We can talk more about this. This is just to give you, for those of you that forgot already or don't know the details. The occupation took place in Square Victoria, downtown Montreal, from October 15, 2011 to November 25, 2011, when the occupiers were evicted by the police. So that's on the first day, October 15. The first weekend, about 3,000 people showed up. There was a big assembly. The first night, about 100 tents were put in the square, and then it was about 200, 250 tents. And participation varied between 100 and 200 people, during the whole occupation. So this is just the first day. That's the campground. That's the kitchen. So I'll skip also. I did a survey, so I have data about education level, income, occupation. But I'll skip that. We can get to that during the Q&A. But I want to get to other stuff. For the income, you can see it's not very high. Most people are in the lower segment. This one I think is interesting because it shows, the N is, we interviewed 75 people, the N is higher than 75 because people could check several answers. But it shows basically that people had some basic political experience. They had been active in, basic stuff was voting, but also had participated in protests, that even organized protests. So this maybe could fit the claim that the repertoire was a factor here. But I want to focus on a specific segment of the occupiers. Because the occupiers were not just people camping, sleeping. Many people were not sleeping on the occupation site. They were just going back home, or staying with friends, but they would spend the whole day or a few hours a day at the occupation site going to either meetings or the General Assembly and so on. And there's a bunch of people, maybe 30, 40, the numbers kind of vary, that, you know, were not leaders because they don't have a leader as such, but were doing, you know, leading tasks. What Jennifer Earle calls leading tasks, or, you know, another way of thinking about organizing work. And the main ones were maintenance, so basically the logistics of the occupation, then the facilitation team, so running the assemblies with all the signals and all that, and taking the stack for the least people wanted to talk, and then the media team, so dealing with communication. Now, this group was more educated than the average. They at least had all a BA, sometimes were also MA or PhD students. They all had jobs, and if not, they were artists, so they had, you know, precarious jobs, but still they were not unemployed. Several of them had good, stable jobs. They were professors and resigned and left their jobs to occupy full-time. So you can see, you know, there's other ways of using your skills. And also what is interesting is that most of them, I would say, well, not most of them, but Anglo activists were overrepresented. That is, the bulk of occupiers were Francophone, but among the organizers had a strong presence of Anglo activists. But the assemblies were in French. They were all bilingual. So what I want to tell you is that there was basically just three groups were competing to shape the rules of the game, were facing different problems, were competing for status, for resources within the occupation. And that led to different ways of thinking about politics and the proper way to organize. The most exposed group was the facilitation team, because it was the only one that could not bypass the assembly, by definition. The others could bypass the assembly. So this was a dynamic and contradictory process, okay. For a very simple reason is that some people at the beginning were against the assembly, and really said we despise the assembly, and ended up believing in the assembly. And the other way around, some people began believing in horizontalism and the assembly and direct democracy, and ended up not believing at all in direct democracy and being very critical of this process. So just a few quotes, and I'll be quick on this, obviously, because I have only 5 minutes and I have many quotes. This is just to stress the experimental part. You can say, you know, we don't really know where we're going, improvisation, we're refusing pre-established structures, and so on. So that's, you know, a member of the facilitation team explaining, you know, how they got to this, and saying that they tried different models before the beginning of the occupation. So they had several meetings before the beginning of the occupation discussing, so how to manage an assembly, how should we do this? And the Morin code is the code that is used for student assemblies. And they tried it and said, doesn't work, it's too formal, it's a waste of time, too bureaucratic, let's drop it. Let's try the consensus, and emphasize the symbols. No, people want to talk, they don't want to use the symbols, let's drop it. And it's only 2 weeks after the beginning of the occupation. They thought, what did people in Wall Street do, you know, and how did they manage this? So it took 2 weeks after the beginning of the occupation for people to try to imitate the occupied Wall Street. So it was not given at the beginning of the process. They even refused, there was a handbook produced by people in Spain that was translated in English, how to cook a peaceful revolution. It was about how to manage assemblies, and people refused to use that as a model, saying that we cannot universalize the models for liberation. This one, I think, from the maintenance teams, the people in charge of logistics, saying basically that, you know, this is a waste of time. People want to talk forever, and I'm here to solve problems. So, you know, it's nice to, as the occupier says, you know, I understand we're trying to create an alternative form of democracy here, but at the same time, there's garbage that has to be picked up, you know. So basically, it's nice to talk, but, you know, there's work to do. But that same person that despised the assembly at the beginning, actually, it's a long quote, sorry, but I think it explains very well the process, actually got to enjoy the assembly, and not simply because it could be manipulated, but actually because that occupier realized that you could talk to people, actually. You know, it was not just manipulation or lying or deception. You could actually talk to people, and if people, you know, got enough information and there was a level of trust, they could actually feel, that they were actually participating in the process. So that occupier, like the same one as the previous quote, at the beginning despised direct democracy, was a waste of time, and ended up actually after 3 or 4 weeks of occupation believing in direct democracy. So a kind of a learning process. This one, a facilitation team that at the beginning was a big believer in direct democracy, could not take it anymore. The occupier was just sick of the assemblies. Like, give me a break, I had enough of this. And saying, this is not a viable model, forget it. We can't even manage a square, so forget about, the world. Someone from the media team saying, basically, we manage communication, we have to be able to react quickly to the media, to what's happening in the news. We cannot go through the assembly each time. It's just, not efficient. And by the way, who's the assembly to tell us what to do? They have no legitimacy. They don't function properly. I don't have to finish, so. So the waste of time, and finally the return of power. The media team leaving the assembly and saying, this is a nice experiment. We have to be scientific, and like any good scientific experiment, you need to control the environment. And if you cannot control the environment, you cannot test a hypothesis. So control meant basically leaving the assembly, leaving the occupation, and basically becoming some sort of vanguard group where you do everything on your own. Or if you want to be nice, then because it's just an affinity group. But it was more the logic of vanguard. The people will follow, basically. And the last quote that I think is just how people were trying to see the occupation is from an English teacher, English and history teacher in high school that resigned, quit his job to occupy full-time at Square Victoria. And that's what he says about the power dynamics at the occupation. So it's funny, the last book I was teaching my English class before I left was Animal Farm. So for me, it was just like Animal Farm. So he was seeing, power dynamics at play, and he was becoming more pessimistic about the outcome. So, what I want to emphasize here is that horizontalism was not the only way to organize. There's nothing self-evident and obvious about organizing horizontally, so we have to problematize it. We need to account for it. Why do people rely on assemblies? There's nothing obvious about it, and they had other ways of organizing, so we need to explain as basically a dependent variable, as an outcome, instead of taking it for granted. And what I try to show is that this is really a process that is uncertain, that is political because of struggles for power, resources, for status, and also practical because it evolves as people try to solve concrete problems that they're facing. And we cannot predict in what direction it's going to go, as I showed. Some people started believing, ended up not believing, and the other way around. Thank you.
For their kind invitation. So the title of the talk today is The Indignados as Autonomous Movement, Tracing Movement Continuity from the Global Justice Movement. The Indignados in Spain have drawn attention for the strength and longevity of their mobilizations, which took many observers by surprise. And two features have been highlighted as particularly noteworthy. The first is the refusal to allow institutional left actors to participate in or represent the movement, framed as a movement of ordinary citizens. And the other is their insistence on the use of deliberative democratic practices in large public assemblies as a central organizing principle. And as with many emergent cycles of protest, some scholars and observers attribute the mobilizations with spontaneity and newness. And in this article, what I argue is that the ability of the Indignados to sustain mobilization based on deliberative democratic practices is not at all spontaneous, but it's actually the result of the evolution of an autonomous collective identity predicated on deliberative practice and a deliberative movement culture in Spain since at least the early 1980s. And my discussion highlights the need for historically grounded analysis that pays close attention to movement cultures in understanding contemporary anti-austerity mobilizations. So the first question is, why do we need to debunk spontaneity theses? Whenever autonomous movements in particular mobilize en masse, ink begins to flow. from the pens of observers, journalists, and even some scholars about how unprecedented, spontaneous, and so on the mobilizations are. Such was the case with the so-called color revolutions in Eastern Europe, which were deemed to have sprung up spontaneously overnight, or were the result of foreign funding or external influences in some cases. That was the claim that was made. Another example is that of the political flash mob in Madrid in the 13th of March following the Madrid train bombings in 2004. One scholar, for example, wrote that evidence suggests that they were entirely spontaneous and were organized through mobile phones, whereas another characterized them as a howl of grief and rage directed at the government that in the course of 3 days brought it down. Now, these types of arguments make it seem that protests spring from the ether, without the intervention of social movement actors and in the absence of organizing structures. Yet social movement scholars know that while short-lived mobilizations and protests can certainly erupt based on precipitating or trigger events, sustained mobilizations do not arise out of nowhere, but rely on pre-existing social networks. And what these spontaneity theses do, unwittingly or not, is to deny agency to social movement networks and to the actors who organize them. So, I'm forgetting all about my PowerPoint, as I'm trying to be quick. So the search for the new really turns our gaze away from the history, and it turns our gaze away from the agency of political actors, and it downplays the importance of movement cultures in shaping collective action. That is the argument I'm making. Why are these type of spontaneity arguments so common? Partly it's because people don't study the movements they write enough. They write about enough. Maybe they need to do a little bit more homework. But also, it's actually quite understandable, especially when we're talking about autonomous movement. And this is due to particular characteristics of these movements. The first being a refusal to identify as formal recognizable organizations. A refusal of representation by established leaders or parties or unions. And this leads to a sort of deliberate auto-invisibility, which makes it difficult for outside observers to actually recognize the structures that are behind the mobilizations in many cases. Another reason is one that's kind of been alluded to already, which is that, activists themselves in every cycle of protest are actually new to protest. So to them it is new, and they think it's new, which is perfectly understandable. I've been studying movements in Spain since the early 1990s, and by now, things don't look so new to me as they did back then. But what I'm arguing in this paper is that the Indignados are representative of autonomous movements in Europe in general and in Spain in particular. Movements which share a number of key features. Marcos addressed some of these. I use the term autonomous movement deliberately. I don't use horizontalism. This isn't just some sort of scholarly, superficial preference. It's based on the fact that a lot of my work is actually on autonomous movements. And it's the distinction between autonomous movements and institutional left movements or actors in the European political context, the European social movement context, is actually a central cleavage. And it has been for decades. In fact, it has been for centuries. We can go right back to debates between the anarchists and the communists in the 1800s, and we will find some similar arguments as to the ones that we're finding today. So it's not just a question of I choose this method or I choose that method. It's a lot deeper than that. But anyway, just to go over some features. I'm still jet-lagged, I'm sorry, I'm very dehydrated. Some features which you have already, we've already talked about a little bit are rejecting representative democracy, rejecting majority rule, defending a participatory model, non-hierarchical structures, etc. And decision-making generally takes place in the form of an assembly, rarely with permanent delegations of responsibility. And of course, key, always, is a refusal to allow the institutional left to represent or to co-opt or to intervene in the movements. Now, that doesn't mean that institutional left actors are not welcome. They are welcome. They're welcome as individuals. They're just not welcome as representatives of their collectives. And there's lots and lots of reasons for this, and I have a lot of work written on that. If anyone's interested in this particular topic, you can certainly talk to me, and I'll be happy to refer you to some of them. But what this means for the argument today is that this has implications for how these networks are mobilized in new contexts, in new cycles of mobilization. And the lack of formal organizational infrastructures means that collective identity processes that are sustained and developed in movement subcultures, such as urban and rural social centers, university student groups, and other movement-related scenes, enables this rapid mobilization in new contexts, rather than the mobilization of formally organized membership structures. So the maintenance of collective identity and movement culture, including deliberative practices, master frames, and so on, in periods of relative latency or in periods of abeyance, is still a really understudied aspect of mobilization, but it's crucial to explaining the continuity and evolution of movement culture, or conversely its rupture, from one movement cycle to the next. So let's just look at one key feature that observers noted, which was the Spanish Indignados' ability to manage deliberative consensus-based assemblies of up to 5,000 participants. Research on movement learning processes demonstrates that these abilities cannot be convincingly explained by either a commitment to ideological principles or by transnational diffusion processes that lead to wholesale adoption of practices. And I think we saw that in Marcos's example already. The effective management of large deliberative assemblies has been a key challenge of social movements in Spain over the past 2 decades. The adoption of deliberative techniques has been slow and arduous, not least because of resistance from institutional left actors in those spaces who believed in a more hierarchical approach to organizing. And I've written a lot about this elsewhere, and I'm not going to go into much more detail about it here, but I just wanted to highlight some key points and illustrate them with a few examples for you. So the learning processes of democratic practices need to be understood in relation to the historical development of deliberative practices in the context of Madrid and in the context of Spain. And this is tied to the development of autonomous collective identity that itself is a result of a number of processes. The historical roots of this can be traced back to at least the early 1980s, as I said before, but clearly the most recent predecessor is the global justice movement. So what are some of the processes that we can trace? The first process we can trace is the shift to the local. In the mid-2000s, the global justice movement was already sort of, the counter-summit model was already beginning to wind down. And many in the movement began to turn to more local or national initiatives as a way of actually doing effective politics. The global scene didn't seem to be getting people that far, or that was the feeling of a lot of people. And in Madrid, this shift came really early. But it was also a logical continuation of local grassroots initiatives and traditions. In Madrid, I don't know, Manuel Castells has a wonderful book on grassroots politics in the city. And he did a study back in the 1970s on the neighborhood association meetings in Madrid, which formed a really central expression of civil society in the very repressive context of the Franco dictatorship. And it was a key way, these neighborhood associations, these very local associations, were a key way to press for more democracy in a context where that was a really difficult argument to make under an authoritarian regime. So there were strong leaders for different reasons. It wasn't entirely an assembleario or autonomous model by any means, but it does show some early roots of this kind of tradition in Spain. Assemblearismo, or assembly-style social movement politics, is a tradition that's been developed in squatter movements, in anti-militarist movements, feminist movements, environmental spaces, popular education projects, anti-capitalist circles, and contrary to some claims, some newness claims about the Indignados, this actually has a really long tradition and a long history in Spain. Participatory practice in Spain was not imported wholesale from the global justice movement. It developed over time in local networks, although the global justice movement was an important source of inspiration for it. And this is consistent with what we know about diffusion processes. They're more resistant to adoption than many narratives would actually lead us to believe. They need to be translated to local cultures in order to be effective and in order to be adopted successfully. And that doesn't always happen. Autonomous practice and the collective identity was a highly contested process. It had a slow, arduous development. And it was localized in many ways, and it still is. And we can see this in variations of practice in Spain from city to city. Barcelona, for example, traditionally, I don't know now, but has always been much more obsessed, for example, with a very strict understanding of consensus. Activists in Madrid don't follow that as a practice. They use sort of a critical consensus, not a strict understanding of consensus. We can look even back to anarchist traditions from the early 20th century in Spain, although the continuity of that is debatable, given that we had a dictatorship in between, but I leave that as an open question. Certainly the Ocupa, the anti-capitalist squatter movement, which was loosely coordinated in Lucha Autónoma, was incredibly important in Madrid. They were very highly reflexive about deliberative practice, very committed to engagement with local communities, and they were some of the earliest struggles against precarity, which now everybody knows about, but this was being debated in the early 1990s already in Madrid. So, how much time do I have for school?
Almost 7 minutes.
Bon, je vais bien. Okay, so here's a quote I'd like to read you that's describing a direct action. On the 5th day of protest, we appeared in the stock exchange. At 12 in the morning, more than 100 people had managed to enter the opulent building, Plaza de la Lealtad, and interrupt the session while we shouted slogans against precarity and social exclusion. Outside, 20 mothers dressed in black supported the action, holding up a placard against precarity and distributing pamphlets. This might sound like an account of a direct action of the Indignados of 15M, but it's actually from 1999, and the series of direct actions that were taken in Madrid in the annual Rompamos el Silencio, Let's Break the Silence, campaign that's carried out by activists in various groups in the anti-capitalist network there. And that was organized within one of the major occupied social centers in Madrid at the time, called El Laboratorio Uno. So clearly the critiques of the anti-capitalist movements also have carried over into the current wave of protest, and many of the frames and slogans are very similar, if not the same. The importance of the anti-capitalist Ocupa movement, Escuela Populares, neighborhood association movements really can't be overstated in understanding the nourishing of grassroots citizen participation in Madrid in 15M. Here's another quote. Kind of a long one, sorry. What do we mean when we say that social networks and the citizens need to enter the decision-making process? What are we really based on? What do we want? We believe in a participatory, deliberative democracy. That's the real nexus between all these different groups. People want to participate, not just be passive receptors of decisions. We want to create tools to be active political subjects, and we have a social responsibility towards our social environment at the local, national, and global level. We have to clarify our relationship to power. We need to ask ourselves, what is this new political culture that we in the social movements are trying to develop? What does it consist of when we assume responsibilities? How do we want to intervene, and what mechanisms can we develop so that those real powers can be limited by the public and so that the public can really intervene in the legislation that governs the multinationals. As with the example above, I think this quote could perfectly come from the Indignados, could easily have come from a member of any of these assemblies that we've been hearing about, but it comes from an activist in the Madrid Global Justice Movement Network in 2002. So I'm not just tracing continuity, though, in my paper. I'm also talking about evolution. And while a critique of the political and economic elites has been at the heart of anti-capitalist and autonomous protest for decades, there has been a turn to a much more sustained, profound, and engaged critique of the democratic institutions themselves that were put in place during the Spanish transition to democracy, and of specific mechanisms that facilitate political corruption, lack of transparency, and lack of true or real democracy. There's also been a shift towards some less symbolic and more practical direct interventions. Some examples include the Stop Evictions campaigns, which are literally trying to block the evictions of the authorities when they come to evict people from their homes. Fundraising initiatives to indict Rodrigo Rato, because he was the director of Bankia. Wiki pages, which list all the politicians who are indicted or found guilty of corruption of all the parties in Spain. So that's freely available now, thanks to the activists. They also have created lists that show the overlap between political office holders and corporate board members, which is also very useful. A bit of information. The occupation of banks, the setting up of support systems for those evicted, the creation of time banks and other forms of alternative economy schemes, and so on. But symbolic action, of course, as with all movements, is still incredibly important. One example that's actually from Portugal that we've been seeing are the dumping of bags of trash in front of the banks. Has anybody seen this? People just take their bags of garbage and dump them in front of the bank, how do you say sucursal? The bank offices? The branch. Thank you, the branch offices. Another one that sort of taps into Spanish cultural narratives are the flamenco flash mobs, where they go in dancing flamenco into the bank and they have all the song, and the verses are critiquing the capitalist system and the bank's profiteering and so on. So these are quite fun and quite symbolic, but quite powerful as well. Now, my stress on continuity, I would like to make this very clear, does not deny the importance of precipitating or intermediate factors in mobilizing support for protests and for the movement. We have a global crisis, we have unemployment up through the roof, people are losing their homes. All of this, of course, raises consciousness and affects that the public opinion largely supports the 15M movement. We also have, of course, important sources of inspiration that come from outside of Spain. The Arab Spring was incredibly inspirational. The Greek, the Portuguese, the Icelandic protests, student protests all across Europe, and all of this predates 15M, and it was very much a point of reference for these mostly young activists who initiated this in deciding that they also wanted to do something. So the transnational aspect is very important. There are other aspects, such as the absolute sort of betrayal that many people felt when the three major unions signed a labor agreement with the government and so on, and the failure of the general strike. We can also point to some more recent precursor movements in Spain. The anti-Bologna protests were incredibly important. I'm just finishing. And university students have been really key in this movement. V de Vivienda, Jóvenes Sin Futuro, Movement for the Right to Housing, and 13M, which I mentioned before, was actually a really important precursor event. When 13M happened, a lot of the kids who I know now who are active in 15M were students at the university when 13M, or just starting university when 13M happened, and it really had a huge impact symbolically. There was the first time ever in Spain that activists had deliberately defied the prescription against any kind of political mobilization the day before the elections, because it's illegal. It's the day of reflection. I don't know if you have this in Canada. you can't talk about politics, you can't talk about any kind of politics the day before people go to vote. And so that was a very deliberate direct action that was very deliberately illegal and had a huge repercussion and also an impact on elections. So, just finishing up, I'll actually just skip this next quote. It's a very nice one, but I'll skip it. So I just conclude by saying, it's not possible to adequately analyze social movement dynamics and development without considering the culture and the history of movements and how they're shaped by local and national contexts. The maintenance of collective identity and movement culture through movement networks in periods of latency are really important to understand this continuity and rupture from one cycle to the other. This discussion has highlighted the need for historically grounded analysis, and I've showed that, I hope, that 15M Indignados is not a spontaneous collective response to the precipitating events or even to the intermediate causes, but neither the precipitating nor the intermediate causes on their own would have led to sustained mobilization, especially not based on assembly deliberative practices and public occupations. Had it not been for the long, slow march of autonomous social movements over the past 30 years in Spain, inspired, influenced, and often legitimated by outside movements, certainly, but forged on the local and national terrain of struggle. I'm also not arguing that there's nothing new about these recent mobilizations. As I've indicated above, there's been a significant shift towards an emphasis on the reform of the democratic institutions and structures themselves, a deep questioning of the structures put in place during the transition to democracy, and this is also important, we can talk about it later if you want, a sustained attack on the corruption of the political classes, which signals not only a significant development within Spanish social movements, but also points to a strong line of connection with waves of contention elsewhere in Europe, the Americas, and North Africa. Our search for the new, important as it is, should not come at the expense of erasing the history and agency of the social movements and activists that have come before and paved the way for the current response to the global crisis, its architects, and its beneficiaries. Thank you very much.